Imagine a world where your very existence could be twisted into a weapon against you. Time when whispering neighbors, a jealous rival, or even just bad luck could shatter your life. What if every choice, every word, every single aspect of your being was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion? Welcome to 920. At a harsh reality for women, where freedom was a dream and accusation was a daily threat. What were the darkest shadows lurking around women in this distant past? Number 10. The burden of barrenness. In the year 920, a life was utterly dependent on continuation, on the next generation springing forth from the current one. The very fabric of society, from the humblest peasant's plot to the grandest lord's lineage, relied on the promise of progeny. For women, this expectation was not merely a social nicety, it was a fundamental pillar of their identity and their worth within the community. When a woman did not conceive, when months turned into years without the swell of a pregnant belly, the silence of the empty cradle became a deafening roar of suspicion, barrenness. The inability to bear children was almost universally laid at the feet of the woman. It was a failure of her body, a perceived shortcoming of her very nature, and in a world where divine will was seen in every harvest and every hardship, it could quickly be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a curse, or even a hidden sin. Consider the young bride, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, brought from her family's village to her new husband's homestead. Her primary duty, understood by all, was to provide heirs, particularly male heirs, to secure the family's future and labor for the fields. Her worth, in the eyes of her husband, her in-laws, and the wider community, was intrinsically tied to her fertility. When seasons passed and no child arrived, the whispers would begin. At first, they might be sympathetic expressions of pity for the young woman who had not yet been blessed, but as time wore on, sympathy curdled into suspicion. Was she truly barren, or was she somehow at fault? Was there a secret sin in her past? A pact with shadowy forces, or some unknown transgression that had angered the heavens and closed her womb? The accusations were rarely direct shouts in the marketplace. Instead, they were insidious, creeping like tendrils through the close-knit communities. A woman who was barren might find herself ostracized, excluded from the women's gatherings, where stories were shared and solace found. Other mothers might subtly keep their children away from her, fearing that her misfortune was contagious, a blighting curse that could be passed on. Her husband, perhaps initially patient, would grow increasingly frustrated. His inheritance, his family's name, his very future depended on a successor. A barren wife threatened everything. He might seek remedies from local wise women, sometimes resorting to strange rituals or bitter concoctions, hoping to coax life from her body. If these failed, the accusations could escalate. The most severe accusation a barren woman faced was that she was withholding life, either consciously or through some supernatural influence. Some might even suggest she was a dry tree, a term that carried the weight of divine judgment and failure. In a society where women's bodies were often viewed as vessels for procreation, an empty vessel was a grave disappointment, an anomaly that defied the natural order as understood by the people of 920. The legal and social consequences, though not codified in grand statutes solely for barrenness, were devastating. A man had grounds, recognized by custom and often by emerging legal practices, to repudiate a barren wife. She could be sent back to her family in disgrace, her marriage annulled, her standing in the community utterly shattered. She would have lost her home, her husband, and any hope of security in a world that offered little for a woman without the protection of a family. Consider the psychological toll this must have taken. A woman in 920, and living under the constant shadow of this expectation, would internalize this pressure deeply. Each menstrual cycle, each month, without the confirmation of pregnancy, would be a fresh wave of dread. She would hear the hushed conversations, see the knowing glances, and feel the weight of her perceived failure. There was little understanding of male infertility, which historically was rarely considered the cause of a childless marriage. The burden, the blame, and the subsequent accusations invariably fell upon the woman. She was accused not of a specific crime in the legal sense, but of a profound failure to fulfill her societal role, a failure that carried with it the insidious suggestion of spiritual or moral imperfection, a mark that could never truly be washed away. Her existence was a perpetual accusation against the natural order, a constant reminder of unfulfilled promise in a harsh and unforgiving world. Number 9. The tongue of gossip and slander. In a world before printing presses, before widespread literacy, before any form of rapid communication, information traveled on the wind, carried by human voices. In 920, the spoken word was a powerful, almost tangible force, capable of building reputations or tearing them down in a matter of days. For women, whose lives were often confined to the domestic sphere and the immediate community, the arena of social interaction, however limited, became a minefield where a careless word, a misheard glance, or a malition of goppication could become a devastating accusation of gossipation. Gossip, in the early medieval period, could be a tool of social control, a weapon wielded by those who felt threatened, envious, or simply bored. Slander, the deliberate spreading of false and damaging statements, struck at the very core of a person's honor and standing within the community, and for women whose reputation was often their most valuable yet most vulnerable asset. Such an accusation could be ruinous. A woman's standing was tied to her perceived chastity, her obedience, her industriousness, and her piety. Any whisper that challenged these attributes could shatter her world. Imagine a woman named Aethelflaed, known for her sharp wit, and perhaps a bit too much independence in her manner. She might speak her mind freely, perhaps criticize a neighbor's lazy habits, or question a local elder's judgment. While a man might be seen as merely outspoken, Aethelflaed's assertiveness could quickly be twisted by those who resented her. Suddenly whispers might circulate that she spoke ill of the village priest, that she spread malicious rumors about another woman's family, or that she disclosed private matters that should have remained secret. These whispers, fueled by envy or disapproval of her unconventional spirit, would snowball. She would be accused of having a loose tongue, of being a talebearer, or, more gravely, a slanderer who actively sought to harm others through her words. The impact of such an accusation was profound and immediate. A woman accused of gossip or slander would find herself socially isolated. Other women, fearing that their own secrets might be revealed or that they would be caught in the web of her alleged malice, would avoid her. She might be excluded from communal activities, from shared tasks like weaving or harvesting, where women typically bonded and offered mutual support. Her reputation would be tarnished, making it harder for her children to find suitable spouses, impacting the family's standing, and potentially even affecting her husband's business or social relationships. If the slander was severe enough, perhaps accusing another of theft, adultery, or even witchcraft, it could lead to direct legal action, however rudimentary. Local customary law might prescribe various forms of public shaming, or even financial penalties for those found guilty of malicious slander. The accusation of gossip and slander was particularly potent because it played into existing stereotypes about women, that they were naturally inclined to chatter, to spread rumors, and to be envious of one another. This perception allowed any woman, regardless of her actual intent, to be easily labeled a danger to social harmony simply by speaking. Furthermore, for a woman, her word was often her only defense if her word was deemed unreliable. If she was known as a slanderer, then any defense she might offer against another accusation would be dismissed out of hand. Her credibility would be utterly destroyed. Therefore, The threat of being accused of gossip or slander forced women into a precarious silence. They had to weigh every word, every observation, every personal opinion against the potential for it to be twisted and turned into an accusation that could unravel their entire social standing. Tongue, a seemingly harmless instrument, became a potential weapon in the hands of others, an easy target for those who wished to control, demean, or punish women for stepping, however slightly, outside the narrowly defined boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior in 920 AD. Her reputation was her shield, and slander was the blade that could pierce it, leaving her vulnerable to every other dark accusation the world might devise. Number 8. The price of disobedience. In the meticulously ordered, deeply hierarchical world of 920 odd, every individual had a defined place, and for women that place was almost always one of subordination. Whether as daughters, wives, or widows, a woman's life was intricately woven into the framework of male authority. Her father, her husband, her male relatives, and the local lord or church leader. Disobedience, therefore, was not merely a character flaw, it was a profound transgression against the established social order, a challenge to the very foundation of medieval society. The accusation of disobedience against a woman was a serious matter, touching upon control, power, and the preservation of patriarchal norms. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Isolde, who was expected to marry a man chosen by her father, a union designed to strengthen family alliances or secure land. If Isolde, for whatever reason, refused this match, if she expressed her desire to choose her own path, she would immediately be accused of disobedience. This was not a minor quibble. It was an act of defiance against paternal authority, a rejection of her family's perceived best interests, and a challenge to the deeply ingrained custom of arranged marriages. Her refusal would be seen as stubbornness, rebelliousness, and a fundamental failure to honor her father's wishes, which were often considered paramount and almost divine in their authority. Within marriage, the wife's obedience to her husband was a cornerstone of the household. The husband was the head of the family, and his authority was expected to be absolute. A wife who argued, who challenged his decisions, who neglected her assigned duties, or who simply failed to submit to his will in any significant way, could swiftly face the accusation of disobedience. Imagine a woman perhaps named Bertha, who refused to manage the household in the manner her husband dictated, or who spoke up too often at shared meals, voicing opinions that contradicted his. Her actions, seen as undermining his authority, would lead to her being labeled as disobedient, a headstrong woman who defied her natural order. This accusation carried immense weight because it threatened the microcosm of power within the home, a reflection of the larger social hierarchy. The consequences for a disobedient woman could be severe, ranging from immediate physical punishment within the home. Husbands were legally and socially sanctioned to chastise their wives, to social ostracization. A woman known for her disobedience would be seen as a difficult, unreliable, and even dangerous individual. Other families might be wary of marrying into her kin, fearing that her independent spirit would be passed on. In extreme cases, repeated disobedience could lead to her being repudiated by her husband, effectively divorced, and sent back to her family in disgrace, losing her social standing, her home, and any access to resources. This was a dire fate in 920 AD, where a woman's survival depended almost entirely on her connection to a protective male lineage. Furthermore, disobedience was often linked to other, more serious accusations. A disobedient wife might be suspected of infidelity, as her unwillingness to submit to her husband's will might be interpreted as a sign of secret desires or allegiances elsewhere. A disobedient daughter might be seen as impious, as if her defiance of her father also implied a defiance of God's order. The accusation of disobedience was a catch, all a foundational charge that could easily pave the way for other more damaging claims, because it spoke to a woman's perceived lack of moral character and her refusal to accept her assigned place in the cosmic and social scheme of things. It was a constant reminder that for women in 920 AD, conformity and submission were not merely virtues, They were requirements for survival, and any deviation was met with the harsh hand of accusation and punishment. Number 7. The shadow of theft and dishonesty. In the agrarian societies of 920 AD, survival was often a precarious dance on the edge of scarcity. Possessions were few, and their value was immense, intrinsically tied to sustenance, shelter, and the very continuation of life. Trust within communities was paramount, especially in villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, and resources were often shared or closely guarded. Therefore, the accusation of theft or dishonesty against anyone was grave. But against a woman it carried additional layers of suspicion, reflecting not just a breach of law but a perceived moral failing that challenged her reliability. Women in 920 had often held significant responsibilities within the domestic sphere. They managed household goods, oversaw food stores, prepared meals, and were sometimes involved in local bartering or small-scale production, like weaving or brewing. Their access to and control over these resources, however limited, made them potential targets for accusations of mismanagement or outright theft, whether of family resources or those belonging to neighbors. Consider a woman named Hild, a diligent wife and mother, who managed her family's meager food stores through a lean winter. If, by chance, a neighbor's chicken went missing, or if an argument arose over the precise yield of a shared patch of garden, suspicion could easily turn to Hild. She might be accused of taking what was not hers, of hoarding more than her fair share, or of simply being dishonest in her dealings. The accusation could stem from simple misunderstanding, from a rival's jealousy, or from genuine scarcity that led to suspicion and desperation within the community. The specifics of property ownership were often murky, based on custom and oral agreements rather than written deeds, which made such accusations even easier to levy and harder to definitively refute. Beyond outright theft, dishonesty could manifest in various forms that women were particularly vulnerable to. A woman who managed the household supplies might be accused of skimping on provisions for her husband or children, perhaps suspected of secretly trading them away for personal gain or of being wasteful. A woman involved in brewing ale or weaving cloth might be accused of watering down her product or shortchanging customers in a transaction. While men faced similar accusations in their trades or farming, a woman's supposed dishonesty struck deeper at the perceived moral core of the household and her role as a trustworthy steward of its limited resources. The consequences of being accused of theft or dishonesty were severe. Public humiliation was a common punishment. A woman might be forced to make a public confession, endure a public shaming, or even suffer physical punishment depending on the severity of the alleged crime and the local customs. Her reputation, already so fragile, would be irrevocably damaged. No one would trust her in transactions. Neighbors would avoid her, and her family's standing would be diminished. If the theft was substantial, or if it involved goods belonging to a powerful local lord or the church, the punishments could be far more drastic, potentially including banishment, mutilation, or even death, though such extreme measures were less common for minor household disputes. The accusation of theft or dishonesty against a woman in 920 AD also played into the stereotype of women as inherently less trustworthy or more susceptible to temptation. It was a charge that not only impugned her character, but also called into question her ability to manage the domestic economy properly, a role so crucial to family survival. It was a constant pressure forcing women to be beyond reproach in their handling of every scrap of food, every piece of cloth, every small coin, because any perceived misstep could invite a devastating accusation that undermined her very capacity to function within the communal economy. Her honesty was not merely a virtue. It was a fundamental requirement for her survival and her family's well-being in a world that could not afford to tolerate any perceived breach of trust. Number 6. The fear of infanticide. In the stark realities of 920, a life was often brutal and fleeting. Childbirth was a perilous journey for both mother and child. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high, and the struggle for survival in a world prone to famine and disease was constant. Amidst these harrowing conditions, the accusation of infanticide, the killing of a newborn, loomed as a chilling and particularly abhorrent charge, almost exclusively leveled against women. This accusation was deeply rooted in the harsh social conditions that sometimes forced desperate choices, combined with pervasive religious and moral condemnation of ending a life, especially an innocent one. The circumstances leading to such an accusation were often tragic. Imagine a young, unmarried woman, perhaps a servant girl or a peasant's daughter, who found herself pregnant out of wedlock. For her, pregnancy outside of marriage was not merely a scandal. It was a catastrophic disgrace that could lead to immediate social ostracization, physical abuse, and abandonment by her family. There was no social safety net, no support system for an unwed mother and her child. In such desperate straits, some women, overwhelmed by fear and shame, might give birth alone and secretly. If the child then died shortly after birth, either from natural causes, exposure, or deliberate action, the woman became an immediate suspect. The very fact of a secret birth followed by a hidden death was damning evidence in itself. The accusation did not always require direct witnesses. A woman might be found to have recently given birth, perhaps indicated by her physical appearance or telltale signs. If no infant was presented, if no christening was announced, and especially if the woman denied the pregnancy or claimed a miscarriage that could not be verified, suspicions would mount rapidly. The absence of a live child became proof of a sinister deed. Community, deeply embedded in a moral framework shaped by the Church, viewed the taking of an innocent life as one of the gravest sins, and the unbaptized soul of a child was considered doomed to limbo, adding another layer of horror to the crime. Consider the narrative of a woman named Gunora, who after a secret pregnancy delivered a stillborn child in the dead of night. In her fear and despair, she might bury the tiny body herself, hoping to erase the shame and the evidence of her transgression. But if anyone in the village grew suspicious, perhaps an old woman who noticed changes in Gunora's shape or heard muffled cries, the questions would start. Where is the child? Why was the birth kept secret? The community, driven by fear, moral outrage, and a desire to impose order, would quickly assume the worst. Gunora would be accused of deliberately killing her own offspring, an unthinkable act of depravity. Consequences of an accusation of infanticide were often the most severe possible. While formal legal systems were nascent, local lords and church courts held immense power. A woman accused and convicted of infanticide could face public execution, perhaps by hanging or drowning, as a deterrent to others, and a means of purging perceived moral pollution from the community. Even if she escaped the ultimate penalty, her life would be utterly ruined. She would be branded a monster, cast out from society, and forever haunted by the accusation. Her chances of finding a place in any community, of remarrying, or of living a life free from constant scorn would be virtually non-existent. The fear of infanticide accusations placed an unbearable burden on women, especially those without the protection of marriage or family. It highlighted the devastating powerlessness of women in 920 AD, who found themselves in impossible situations caught between societal condemnation and the desperate need to survive. The accusation itself, often based on circumstantial evidence or mere suspicion, served as a stark warning, a chilling reminder of the unforgiving nature of a society that offered little compassion to those who deviated from its rigid norms, and where the silent death of a newborn could become the loudest, most damning accusation imaginable. Number 5. The whisper of poison. In the early medieval world of 920, a life was fragile and death was an ever-present specter. Disease, injury, and famine could sweep through a community with terrifying speed. When a sudden illness struck, or an unexpected death occurred, especially among the powerful or the well-off, Explanations were often sought beyond the natural world. In such an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, the whisper of poison and the subsequent accusation often settled upon women. This was not merely because women often handled food and medicines in the household. It was rooted in deeper fears and misogynistic assumptions about their nature, their perceived cunning, and their supposed propensity for secretive, insidious acts. Women were the primary caregivers and healers within the domestic sphere. They knew about herbs, their properties and their uses, both medicinal and culinary. They prepared meals, brewed drinks, and nursed the sick. This intimate knowledge and access, while vital to the well-being of the household, could also be twisted into a sinister weapon in the eyes of a suspicious community. If a person fell ill with symptoms that were unfamiliar or perplexing, or if a death occurred under mysterious circumstances, particularly one that benefited someone close to the deceased, the fingers of suspicion often pointed to the woman who controlled the household's sustenance. Imagine the scenario. A wealthy landowner, known for his harsh temper and numerous enemies, suddenly succumbs to a mysterious illness. His wife, perhaps a younger woman who had long endured his cruelty, is immediately viewed with suspicion. Did she, tired of his tyranny, use her knowledge of herbs to hasten his demise? The accusation would spread like wildfire. Perhaps a rival heir eager to claim the inheritance would fuel these whispers, pointing to the wife's access to the deceased's food and drink. The lack of medical knowledge meant that many common ailments, from food poisoning to acute infections, could mimic the symptoms of a slow-acting poison, making it incredibly difficult to distinguish between natural causes and deliberate malice. The accusation of poisoning was particularly potent because it implied a cold, calculated, and deeply malicious intent. It was not a crime of passion or a moment of weakness, but a deliberate act of evil. For women, this accusation played into the stereotype of them being less forthright than men, more prone to cunning and hidden vengefulness. A woman who expressed discontent, who seemed unhappy in her marriage, or who simply did not conform to societal expectations of demure submission, could easily become a target for such a devastating charge. Her perceived deviousness, whether real or imagined, would be seen as evidence of her capacity for such a heinous act. The consequences of being accused of poisoning were dire. Such an accusation often led to immediate arrest and interrogation, frequently involving torture to extract a confession. If convicted, the punishment was almost always death, often in a particularly gruesome manner, reflecting the horror with which the crime was viewed. Her name would be forever tarnished, and her family would bear the shame. Even if acquitted, the suspicion would linger forever. Marking her as someone capable of such a dark deed, she would be ostracized, feared, and viewed with perpetual distrust. The whisper of poison thus cast a long, chilling shadow over the lives of women in 920. Add, it transformed their essential roles as caregivers and household managers into potential instruments of death. It forced them to navigate their domestic lives with an acute awareness of suspicion, knowing that any unexplained illness or death in their household or even among their neighbors could turn them into the prime suspect. It was a terrifying accusation that stripped women of their benevolent roles, reducing them to potential murderers hidden behind a veil of domesticity, always vulnerable to the dark suspicions of a fearful and ignorant world. Number 4. The mark of heresy. In the tightly woven spiritual and social fabric of 920, add, the Christian Church was not merely a religious institution, it was a foundational pillar of daily life, morality, and social order. Doctrines permeated every aspect of existence, from the rhythm of the seasons to the rites of passage. To deviate from its teachings, to hold beliefs contrary to its pronouncements, was to commit heresy, an act that threatened not only an individual's soul, but also the spiritual well-being and stability of the entire community. While major, organized heresies were less common against individual women, in this early period compared to later centuries. The accusation of personal heresy or unorthodox piety could still be devastating, often linked to other perceived moral failings or challenges to authority. A woman could find herself accused of heresy not necessarily for intellectual theological rebellion, but more commonly for practicing folk traditions that clashed with Christian dogma, for challenging the authority of the local priest, or for expressing opinions that seemed to undermine established religious truths. Imagine a woman perhaps named Gudrun, who continued to revere old pagan deities or spirits, or who practiced healing rituals that incorporated pre-Christian symbols and invocations. While many such practices were tolerated as harmless old ways, if they became too prominent, if they seemed to draw people away from the church, or if they were linked to misfortune, Gudrun could be accused of holding heretical beliefs, of worshipping false idols, or of actively opposing God's will. Another pathway to the accusation of heresy for a woman involved her personal piety, or lack thereof. If a woman was seen as insufficiently devout, if she regularly missed church services, if she questioned the authority of the local priest, or if she expressed doubts about particular saints or sacraments, she could be viewed with suspicion. This suspicion could escalate into an accusation of heresy, especially if her behavior was perceived as rebellious or defiant. For instance, a woman who sought spiritual solace outside the formal church structure, perhaps in solitude or through unconventional means, might be seen as dangerous, her independence of thought interpreted as a rejection of divine truth. The accusation of heresy against a woman also often intertwined with other negative perceptions. A woman deemed rebellious or disobedient in her secular life might also be suspected of religious rebellion. Her nonconformity in social matters could easily translate into perceived nonconformity in spiritual matters. Similarly, a woman accused of witchcraft or maleficium, as previously discussed, was often simultaneously charged with heresy, as her supposed magical powers were seen as deriving from the devil or from a rejection of God. The mark of heresy, therefore, often became a convenient catch, all a way to condemn women whose beliefs or practices were deemed deviant or threatening to the prevailing religious and social order. Consequences of being accused of heresy, even in this nascent stage of formal inquisitions, were severe. While large-scale burnings were not yet the norm, a woman found guilty of heresy could face excommunication, a terrifying spiritual condemnation that cut her off from the sacraments and effectively from salvation itself. Socially, excommunication meant complete ostracism. She would be shunned by everyone, unable to participate in community life, viewed as a cursed individual. Property might be confiscated, and she could be banished from the village, left to wander alone in a hostile world. In more severe cases, or if her alleged heresy was seen as particularly dangerous, she could face imprisonment or even death at the hands of secular authorities, often at the urging of the church, though such executions were more common in later centuries. The accusation of heresy thus served as a powerful tool of control, ensuring that women, like all members of society, adhered strictly to the doctrines and authority of the church. It stifled independent thought and spiritual exploration, forcing women into a narrow path of prescribed piety. It meant that a woman's innermost beliefs, her very soul, were subject to scrutiny and judgment, and any perceived deviation could mark her with a chilling brand of heresy, a mark that condemned her in this life and threatened her eternal salvation in the next. Number 3. The scrutiny of the scold. In the tightly knit, often claustrophobic communities of 920, harmony and order were highly valued. Disputes were unsettling, and open conflict could disrupt the delicate balance of communal life. Within this context, the behavior of women was rigorously scrutinized, particularly their verbal expressions. The accusation of being a scold or a shrew was a common and powerful means of social control, used to punish women who were deemed too loud, too opinionated, too argumentative, or who simply stepped outside the narrowly defined boundaries of acceptable feminine speech and demeanor. This was not about grand crimes, but about the everyday performance of womanhood. A scold was a woman who was perceived to be quarrelsome, abusive, nagging, or overly talkative, particularly in a way that disrupted the peace of the household or the community. Imagine a woman named Agnes, perhaps burdened by poverty or a difficult husband, who frequently complained about her lot, argued loudly with her neighbors over small matters, or dared to challenge the pronouncements of local men. Her voice, if deemed too strident or too frequent, would quickly earn her the label of a scold. This was not a legal term in the sense of a written statute, but a deeply ingrained social accusation that carried immense weight. The accusation was not just about noise, it was about authority and defiance. A woman who was a scold was seen as challenging the patriarchal order, as failing to display the expected feminine virtues of meekness, silence, and submission. Her loud voice was interpreted as a usurpation of male authority, a breach of decorum that upset the natural hierarchy. If a woman dared to criticize her husband publicly, to speak back to a lord's servant, or to engage in open arguments with other men or women, she could quickly find herself branded as a public nuisance, a disruptor of peace, a shrew who defied proper conduct. Consequences of being accused of scolding were primarily social, but they could also lead to informal or customary punishments. A woman known as a scold would be shunned. Other women might avoid her company, fearing that her contentiousness would spill over onto them, or that she would bring dishonor to their families. Her neighbors might refuse to help her with tasks or exclude her from communal gatherings. Her reputation would suffer, making it difficult for her children to find suitable marriage partners, as no family wished to take a potentially troublesome woman into their household. In some communities, informal public shaming rituals might be employed, while the infamous scold's bridle or ducking stool were more formalized punishments that emerged in later centuries. Their conceptual roots lie in this earlier period. In 920, a woman accused of scolding might be subjected to public mockery, forced to sit in a prominent place to endure the stares and jeers of the community, or compelled to offer public apologies. These were not legal convictions in a formal court, but powerful social mechanisms designed to enforce conformity and silence women who dared to raise their voices outside accepted norms. The accusation of scolding, while seemingly less dire than charges of murder or witchcraft, was deeply insidious because it policed the very expressions of a woman's personality and her right to speak. It forced women into a perpetual state of self-censorship, weighing every word, every complaint, every opinion against the crushing weight of potential accusation. It meant that a woman's anger, her frustration, her wit, or even her legitimate grievances could be weaponized against her, used to brand her as troublesome and undesirable. Her voice, her most immediate means of self-expression, became a dangerous instrument capable of drawing the community's swift and unwavering condemnation, ensuring that silence and subservience remained the preferred virtues for women in the early medieval world. Number 2. The dark art of maleficium in the shadowy world of 920, where the vast forces of nature were untamed and unexplained, where disease ravaged communities without warning and crop failures meant starvation. When logic failed, they turned to the unseen, to the realm of spirits, curses, and dark magic. And often, particularly when misfortune struck, the accusation of maleficium, the practice of harmful magic, was leveled against women. This was not yet the widespread, institutionalized witch hunt of later centuries, but the deeply ingrained fear of harmful magic, often linked to women, was a terrifying reality. Women, particularly older women, those living on the fringes of society, or those with unusual knowledge of herbs and healing, were often seen as repositories of ancient wisdom, or conversely as conduits for malevolent forces. Their proximity to the cycle of life and death, their role in birth and healing, and their perceived susceptibility to temptation, as narratives often stressed Eve's role in the fall, made them convenient targets for accusations of dabbling in dark arts. If a child fell mysteriously ill, if a cow stopped giving milk, if a man suffered an unexplained injury, or if a storm destroyed a harvest, suspicion would turn to the woman known for her strange remedies, her solitary habits, or her sharp tongue. Consider the plight of an old woman, perhaps named Morwen, who lived alone at the edge of the village, her only companions a few chickens and a cat. She might be sought out for her knowledge of traditional healing herbs, or her ability to mend a broken bone with a poultice. But if, after a disagreement with a neighbor, that neighbor's prized sow sickened and died, the whispers would begin. Morwen's herbal knowledge would be twisted into a means of casting curses. Her solitary nature would be seen as evidence of secret unholy rituals. Her unusual appearance, perhaps a birthmark or a stoop from age, would be interpreted as a sign of her unnatural connection to evil. She would be accused of maleficium, of using unseen powers to cause harm. The accusation of maleficium was particularly insidious because it was so difficult to refute. There was no physical evidence, only circumstantial connections and the potent power of fear and rumor. A string of bad luck in a village could be attributed to a single individual, often a vulnerable woman, who became a scapegoat for the community's anxieties. The accusation also tied into religious beliefs, as any magic outside of the church's sanctioned rituals was seen as demonic, a pact with the devil. Therefore, an accusation of maleficium often carried with it the unspoken or explicit charge of heresy, as the woman was presumed to be working with unholy forces. Consequences for a woman accused of maleficium were terrifying and could range from social ostracism to brutal violence. She would be shunned by the community, her goods boycotted, and her very presence feared. Her reputation would be utterly destroyed, and she would be branded as a bringer of misfortune, a danger to everyone. While formal legal procedures for witchcraft were not yet fully developed, local lords, village elders, or even angry mobs could mete out justice. A woman accused of harmful magic might be subjected to informal trials by ordeal, such as being thrown into a body of water to see if she floated, a sign of guilt, as water was seen as rejecting the impure, or forced to carry hot iron. Physical abuse, banishment from the village, or even death at the hands of an enraged community were very real possibilities, all based on suspicion, fear, and a terrifying lack of understanding. The dark art of maleficium was therefore a constant, chilling shadow over the lives of women in 920 AD. It meant that any personal misfortune, any unexplained ailment, or any perceived slight could transform an ordinary woman into a terrifying symbol of evil, a convenient target for a community's anxieties. It forced women to live with an acute awareness of suspicion, knowing that their knowledge, their independence, or simply their vulnerability could at any moment be twisted into an accusation that condemned them to a terrifying fate rooted in the darkest fears of a superstitious age. Number 1. The stain of sexual immorality. In the fiercely patriarchal world of 920 odd, a woman's worth, her honor, and her very societal existence were inextricably linked to her perceived chastity and her marital fidelity. This was not simply a matter of personal virtue. It was a cornerstone of social order, property, inheritance, and family honor. Purity of lineage was paramount, especially for landowning families, and any challenge to a woman's sexual conduct could unravel the very fabric of society. Therefore, the accusation of sexual immorality, be it adultery, fornication, or even mere impropriety, was perhaps the most common and often the most devastating charge leveled against women. It was a stain that could never truly be washed away. For a young unmarried woman, her virginity was her most valuable asset, her dowry in itself ensuring her eligibility for a good marriage and securing her family's social standing. If a woman was suspected of fornication, of engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage, the consequences were immediate and severe. Imagine a young maiden, perhaps named Edgeith, seen speaking alone with a man in an isolated spot, or whose behavior was deemed too forward. Whispers would begin, then accusations. If she became pregnant out of wedlock, the shame and the accusation of fornication would be undeniable. Her family would be disgraced, her chances of a respectable marriage utterly destroyed, and she might be cast out, left with no means of support in a harsh, unforgiving world. Within marriage, fidelity was an absolute expectation for women. For men, though encouraged, deviations were often overlooked or quietly tolerated, a stark double standard. But for a wife, adultery was considered a profound violation of her marital vows, a direct challenge to her husband's honor, and a dangerous threat to the legitimacy of his heirs and his property. If a woman, perhaps named Senethrith, was suspected of infidelity, perhaps based on a jealous husband's paranoia, a rival's malicious rumor, or even a simple misunderstanding of her interactions with another man, the accusation would be swift and brutal. The evidence for such accusations was often flimsy, based on gossip, a perceived flirtation, or the mere presence of a man near a woman at an unseemly hour. Yet, in a world where a woman's word carried little weight against a man's accusation, suspicion was often enough. A husband accusing his wife of adultery could use it as grounds for divorce, for seizing her property, and even for physical punishment. Historical records, though scarce and often written by men, hint at harsh customary laws that allowed husbands to inflict violence upon unfaithful wives, sometimes even leading to death, often without significant legal repercussions for the husband. The consequences of being accused of sexual immorality were all-encompassing. Social ostracism was almost guaranteed. A woman so accused would be shunned by other women, her family would be shamed, and her children, if she had them, might bear the stigma of her alleged transgression. Her reputation, once lost, could never be regained. She would be deemed unclean, morally corrupt, and dangerous to the moral fabric of the community. For a married woman, the potential loss of her children, her home, and her very livelihood was a terrifying prospect, leaving her utterly destitute and exposed. Beyond the immediate legal or social penalties, the accusation of sexual immorality stripped a woman of her fundamental dignity. It reduced her to her sexuality, and then condemned her for it. It was a constant psychological burden, forcing women to live under an unceasing gaze of suspicion, where every action, every interaction, and every perceived deviation from the strictest moral code could be twisted into a damning accusation. The stain of sexual immorality was a brand that marked a woman for life in 920, at ensuring her perpetual vulnerability and underscoring the immense power wielded by a society that controlled women through the fierce scrutiny of their bodies and their perceived virtue.